Welcome to Scandinavia House Online. I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation and Scandinavia House, and I'm delighted to introduce this virtual program, Experimental Lens, the Photography of Edvard Munch, offered in conjunction with the current exhibition on view in the Scandinavia House galleries, The Experimental Self, Edvard Munch's Photography. It was organized by American Scandinavian Foundation with the Munch Museum in Oslo and brings the photographic work of the master painter to New York City. It was curated by Patricia Berman and has drawn international acclaim for introducing audiences to Munch's photographic and film work, emphasizing his experimentalism and his exploration of the camera as an expressive medium. This exhibition includes Munch's portraits of friends and family, as well as self-portraiture, including images from what he termed his Fatal Destiny portfolio shot between 1902 and 1908. In both still images and in his few forays with a handheld moving picture camera, Munch photographed himself and his environment in ways that rendered them poetic. The exhibition also includes models of the cameras and equipment the artist used. This panel celebrates the release of the 2020 illustrated book, The Experimental Self, The Photography of Edvard Munch, an award-winning publication that includes 120 fully illustrated pages alongside essays by curator Patricia Berman, Tom Gunning, and MaryClaire Pappas, and it is available for purchase in the shop at Scandinavia House. Today's program is organized in 3 segments. First, we will hear from Dr. Berman as she examines a selection of photographs featured in the exhibition. Next, MaryClaire Pappas will expand on her essay in the catalog, examining a series of self-portraits, or selfies, taken by Munch, also featured in the exhibition. Finally, they will join me in a discussion focusing on the relevance of Munch's photos today. Our first speaker, Patricia Berman, is a professor of art history at Wellesley College. Dr. Berman is a leading specialist in early modern Scandinavian art and the author of numerous important scholarly publications in the field. From 2010 to 2015, she held a faculty position at the University of Oslo, Norway, where she continues to be part of a research project entitled Edvard Munch, Modernism and Modernity. Her curatorial work has included the exhibition Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Print, organized for Scandinavia House in New York and Ankara, Turkey, Luminous Modernism, Scandinavian Art Comes to America, a Centennial Retrospective, shown at Scandinavia House in 2011. In Munch's Laboratory, The Path to the Aula, seen at the Munch Museum in Oslo in 2011. And Edvard Munch and the Modern Life of the Soul, seen at the Museum of Modern Art in 2006.
Hello, my name is Patricia Berman, and I'm the curator of The Experimental Self. I wanted to talk about a few of the photographs by Munch that I particularly appreciate for their canny ways of exploring time and space. I view some of these photographs as elements of Munch's time travel and space travel. I love this snapshot of the artist's dog Phipps. Munch was a dog lover who in his later years lived on a large property that included purpose-built studio spaces on the edge of Oslo where he took many of his photographs. I'm charmed by this image of Phipps, both because he's such a scruffy dog and also because Munch, with his discerning eye for composition, managed to align Phipps with light cast through a mullioned window into a kind of a telescoping perspective. The other thing I love about this photograph is the fact that the artist is present as an absence, a shadow hovering along the right edge. The shadow, as a stand-in for the physical presence of a human, was an element that Munch had for years explored as a way of adding a bit of uncanny to his paintings. The absent body, present only as a shadow, was also the stock in trade of cinematic uncanny, as in this scene from Nosferatu, the enormously popular vampire horror film of 1922. However, with Phipps, the shadow seems utterly benign as the artist plays hide and seek with his own image in his own photograph. It's a self-portrait with dog, a kind of a learned composition, the shadow certainly, from Munch's prior work. Around 1930, the artist made a number of self-portraits, which MaryClaire Pappas explores as presaging familiar artifacts of our selfie production. Turning his camera on himself, the artist had the ability to experiment with his own image repeatedly and very cannily. But before going further, I remind us that Munch's photographs are all tiny, between 2.5 and 3.5 inches in width, as opposed to this painting, which is about 55 inches in width. His prints are the size of the cells on his commercial roll film that he used in his small handheld cameras, which he favored. His cameras are about the size of cell phones. So when we look at his photographs, we have to remember, when we compare them to something like a painting in a PowerPoint, that the photographs are minuscule. Using handheld cameras and likely mirrors to help him to frame his self-images, Munch played with posing. In this case, the artist appears out of doors with a hat and without a hat, thrusting his chin forward, possibly to compensate for the sagging skin of his aging neck as he approached 70. That chin long a source of pride and of parody for the artist. Holding still so as to frame himself identically with and without that hat, we see the artist performing for effect. We see him in private, playing with his own image. That's one of the things these photographs reveal. The photographs also suggest other forms of performance, and these I interpret as images of time travel and of self-reflection or perhaps self-parody. In two images in which Munch has staged himself seated in chairs before his paintings, he sits slightly slumped, in profile or near profile. In both from around 1930, he has set a long exposure time on his camera and has moved slightly, creating a blurring of his body in both cases. In these and in so many of his other informal photographs, one can see the background bleeding through his body. The Munch Museum curator, Arne Eggum, likened this kind of pose to Edward Steichen's canonical portrait of Auguste Rodin, silhouetted against his monument to Victor Hugo here on the left-hand side of the screen. In the 1930 photographs, Munch also embodied the pose that he rendered in his many versions of the motif melancholy from around 1891 onward, in both paint and in woodcut. Munch explored a woodcut technique whereby he cut his wood blocks into pieces like a jigsaw puzzle, inked them separately, and fitted them together, enabling him to print different color zones simultaneously. He also exploited the striations of wood graining from his slabs of wood as visible elements in his woodcuts, an effect that you can see in these different impressions of his 1896 printed version of Melancholy, otherwise known as Evening. The vertical patterns of wood graining are visible particularly through and in the image of the seated man's face. I show you that in detail on the right. I understand the woodcut medium in which Munch experimented with the effects of wood graining as a formal element which served as one of the pathways for the artist to explore the effects of bodily transparency in his photographs. The language passed from one medium to the other. Munch's first camera seems to have been the Kodak Bullseye No. 2, an inexpensive and enormously popular amateur model sold globally. The Bullseye Owner's Manual instructed the amateur on the proper placement and settings to achieve an admirable image every time, foolproof. It warned specifically against the kind of mistake that Munch seems to have favored. Absolute failure will result, it read, from opening the aperture wide to take a snapshot or instantaneous image. That would ruin, of course, the print. However, Munch seems to have grooved on those absolute failures. On the left, for example, is a case in which the artist placed a camera on a table in 1906 to 1907, somewhere in 1907, in the German town of Warnemünde, in which he lived for a period of time. The artist's housekeeper sits in the foreground, blurred slightly as she moved during the long exposure time. Munch's contours, in contrast, are absolutely crisp and clear. It seems that he placed himself on a sofa against a wooden wall, posing just long enough to clarify his image, and then ducked out of sight such that the furniture and the wall show through his body. He was considering, and he was using time in an element of this construction. Such play with his his body characterized many of his images taken around 1930, also, as in this image on the right. In fact, these blurred images appear throughout his self-imagery and photography. The effect of transparency, or of motion captured and registered on a photographic image, is of course the mark of time. Translucency, smearing, and blurring are all artifacts of time passing before a camera. An artist can suggest time passing in paint or graphic media, but embedded in the photographic process is time itself. And I see these images as playing with time, therefore, in at least two ways. The artist seems to have taken delight in, or at least explored his curiosity about the effects of his own transparency by registering his body in time, as a photographic blur, as a ghost. In time, meaning he's sitting in chairs in his studio spaces in front of his paintings in the here and now. But I also see him placing his body out of time, outside of his present moment, by embodying motifs from his past, such as melancholy, revisiting the 1890s through pose and ghosting. And it's as though he's both there before his camera and dematerializing into his past work, a gesture both artfully playful, like a tableau vivant, and a melancholic memento of lost time, with his paintings showing through his dematerialized body. Seated before his camera, and with the aid of a mirror, the artist repeatedly created tightly cropped images. In these, we note the shoulder of his heavy tweed jacket bunching around his right shoulder, which is on our left, as he leans into the camera's field, presumably holding the camera in his right hand. You'll note that he wears the same jacket and is posed in front of the same background from one photograph to the other with only minor adjustments of camera angle and placement, except that in the image on the right, the white shirt collar that Munch wears on the left is now tucked into his dark jumper or vest. Again, we see the performing fashionista with and without his starched collar, as we already have seen him with and without his hat. For me, the framing of the head and what I see as the charming decision to remove that big collar re-embodies Munch's most famous self-portrait, a lithograph from 1895. And we have to remember that in his home and studio, he was living within a large body of his past works, always able to access these works, to see them, to think about them. The young artist on the left framed his face with a skeletal arm at the bottom of the image, and at the top, he inscribed his name almost as though it's cast or it's carved in stone. As a man of 30, he poetically represented himself in a space between the living and the dead. But here on the right, as a man heading towards 70, the reenactment of this self-portrait, if indeed it was a kind of a reenactment, is both to my eyes a kind of a charade. I mean, I love the deeply serious face with which he took the image, a performance of past self, an embodiment of what once was, and a measure of time having passed from one image to the next. The photographs are interesting as they relate to our selfie culture. I was here and I looked like that. They also say something about Munch's playfulness with technology, with technologies of invisibility. They also make time itself a medium of dislocation. They make performance visible through posing, whether in play or in dead earnestness. That is why I find these so fascinating. Before closing, I want to thank the scholars whose work on Munch's photographs has opened doorways for the rest of us to see and to consider them. And I want to thank you for your time.
MaryClaire Pappas is a PhD candidate at the Indiana University specializing in modern European art with an emphasis on Scandinavian paintings, prints, and drawings. Her dissertation is entitled Imagining Modernity, Modernism Between Norway and Sweden 1910 to 1920. Her larger research interests include gender and modernism and ideas of the self in modernist culture. MaryClaire holds an MA degree from Queen's University and has previously worked on the catalogue raisonné project for Edvard Munch's drawings at the Munch Museum.
So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the relationship between, or what I see as the relationship between Munch's photographic self-portraits and our own contemporary selfie practices. I was very excited when the Munch Museum asked me to contribute to this publication discussing our own selfies and the relationship between Munch's photographic self-portraits, because I find something so relatable in Munch's practices, but also at the same time, they're an extension of his artistic practice. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how our own selfies can be thought of anew through looking at Munch's. And I'm going to do so by considering these 5 self-portraits, all from 1930, taken at the artist's home in Ekeli. Munch poses either in the front of one or a few of his artworks, however, or in front of his home in Ekeli. However, the focus is not necessarily on anything but Munch himself. Our intention is on the artist. His shoulders, chest, and face occupy most of the space. Perhaps both the pose, kind of, the arms outstretched, ready to take a selfie, and the seriality of the number of selfies might remind us of our own camera roll on our smartphones. And here I'm using myself or my own camera roll as a reference. Our phones are often filled with a plethora of selfies taken either for our own pleasure or to be shared on social media, sent to friends and family via messaging apps, etc. And I, like Munch, tend to take a lot of selfies, so I find this a very fruitful comparison. The artist's actions and my own appear very similar. We both reposition the camera and our face for each of the photographs. We're perhaps searching for the most flattering angle, or simply wishing to see how the self-portrait will appear with each movement of our visage or the photographic apparatus. When I saw the experimental self in Stockholm at Tilska Galleriet, a close friend was walking through the exhibition with me, and she commented, laughing, that Munch takes selfies just about as well as her parents, because, and she's referencing the strange cropping and the sort of blurred face. So this comment is meant to imply that both maybe Munch and her parents don't quite understand the genre of the selfie or how the medium, the camera phone or the camera, is supposed to work. And here I'm referencing, of course, the millennial joke or meme with 2 dogs in front of a weird car background, suggesting that parents don't really understand the cropping or the cropping or the background or the relationship between the self and the camera when taking a selfie. Another friend also was laughing going through the exhibition, partially because she thought it was so funny that Munch took so many self-portraits in front of his own artworks, whereas she, an art historian, also, every time she's in a museum or on a studio visit, tends to take selfies with another artist's artwork. Of course, it's very different, us taking a selfie in front of an artwork today at a museum, and Munch taking a photographic self-portrait in front of his own artworks. But I loved both of these comments because they both point towards just how relatable we seem to find Munch's photographic self-portraits. We imagine ourselves, our friends, our family, perhaps sharing and sending similar photographs. I wonder, are we attracted to Munch's selfies because we recognize our own behavior in these images, taking the same photograph over and over again, trying to find our good angles, or because we consider the selfie a particularly contemporary phenomenon? So it seems strange or perhaps charming that for us to see Edvard Munch, a man who died in 1944, participating in a practice that we consider our own. And the selfie is considered a contemporary phenomenon. It was defined in 2013, as well as referenced earlier, but defined by the Oxford English Dictionary at that point as a photograph that one has taken of oneself, typically with a smartphone or webcam, and uploaded to a social media website. So intertwined with the selfie is this idea that it's going to be uploaded and be shared with the public beyond ourselves. And since this early 2000s, the selfie has permeated our visual culture through these social networking sites, such as Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, Reddit, and Twitter. And everyone I know has an opinion on the selfie. Some view it as an act of narcissism, a potentially liberating tool for self-discovery, as potentially detrimental to one's mental health, or perhaps proof that we no longer know how to exist in a world without imagining ourselves as photographs. Of course, Munch's quote-unquote selfies differ from the current phenomenon of selfie taking, both in medium and intention. Munch's first camera, the Kodak Bullseye No. 2, did not offer an instantaneous viewing experience that we have today, and the camera roll for Munch was very limited based on the length of the roll of film. Today, we're really only limited in the storage on our phone or our iCloud. We can just keep going and going. Yet both Munch's amateur photographic self-portraits taken with his Kodak camera and today's selfie are vernacular image-making practices that have only been made possible through technological advances. And these technological advances have streamlined the production, dissemination, and consumption of visual information. Both Munch and ourselves were getting more and more and more visual information every day. And like Munch, whether we know it or not, we are constantly learning from and responding to the media we employ. We play with the angles, with the posture of the frame, with the photo editing software. So this technology is teaching us about ourselves. So just as Munch explored the malleability of the self in his photographic self-portraits, as well as in his self-portraiture practice across all media, we are learning about ourselves, how we imagine ourselves to be with each selfie we take, and learning how to use and engage with our phone each time we pick it up and do a selfie. In Munch's self-portraits, there's a sense of theatricality that invites a critical investigation of the self, perhaps more consciously than we do in our own selfie practices today. And I'm calling these selfies theatrical for a few reasons. First, the artist is posing in some of these works in front of his own paintings. In doing so, he takes on multiple roles at once. He's the subject of his own selfie, the photographer taking the photograph, and the artist who created the artworks, barely seen behind him. So he's the subject, the photographer, the artist, and these various roles play out simultaneously, demonstrating the complexity of defining Munch as a photographic subject. I also argue that there's a theatricality in the kind of blurred and strange cropping. At first, if we looked at one photo individually, it may seem that this blurring was unintentional, as if the photograph was maybe a bit candid and Munch just happened to move, not quite prepared for the photograph he was about to take of himself. But when seen together, we see that he purposely creates this effect over and over, moving just enough to give the impression of a moving, fleeting body, but not enough for the photograph to be completely blurry. And he does this, and it's this repetition that makes us see how purposeful this act was. So why exactly did Munch find these slightly hazy, slightly blurry self-portraits so fascinating that he repeats this effect so often? Why not keep still and take a quote-unquote proper selfie? Media scholars like Jill Retberg have suggested that on an individual level, selfies allow for a critical investigation of one's own identity, perhaps more akin to Munch's self-exploration rather than when we look at selfies on social media. But she argues this only happens when we look at our own camera roll or perhaps when analyzing our own curated Instagram account. Again, I use my own camera roll of selfies and my own Instagram account so as not to call out anyone else's selfie-taking behavior. In these moments, we see precisely how we're trying to shape our public image and how we are attempting to push the boundaries of the self, or perhaps find the self that we want to see. We curate ourselves for one another and for ourselves. However, common editing tropes, such as the use of filters or Facetune and Photoshop, technology that allows the user to adjust the size of one's waist, muscles, breast, buttocks, etc., clear one's skin, manipulate one's facial dynamics, these become cliches in social media posts because users tend to publish photographs with similar poses and editing techniques. So pretty much when the trope of the selfie become tropes, the selfie loses its critical potential. So we have this technology with photo editing software, filters, tripods, selfie sticks that provide us with numerous possibilities to, like Munch, and experiment with the medium of the selfie. What does a photographic self-portrait mean? What do I mean when I'm doing this behavior? But however, when this criticality becomes lost in a sea of filtered bodies and faces that conform to certain poses and standards of beauty. To conclude, it would be a mistake to uncritically take Munch's amateur photography as akin to today's selfie posted on social media. And it would also be very not correct to romanticize today's selfie as inherently engaging in the same critical work that Munch's photographic self-portraits engage it with. His images were never intended for social media and are often considered an extension of his own artistic practice. Yet Munch's repetitive selfies suggest a critical engagement with the self, a feature that we perceive as lost in today's selfie. Yet at the same time, Munch's photographic self-portraits seem so similar in their mistakes and their repetition. Perhaps this uncanny familiarity of Munch's selfies will give us pause and prompt us to reflect on our selfie-taking practices today, questioning what we consider a quote-unquote proper selfie or a proper image of the self, and why we choose certain poses and tropes. And most importantly, perhaps to question the image of ourselves we repeatedly capture and share with others. Thank you.
Well, hello, Pat, and hello, MaryClaire. It's great to see you, virtually, unfortunately, but I've enjoyed your lectures tremendously, and I know our viewers will also. You've raised a lot of great points, and there's a lot more to discuss, I think. But before we begin the discussion, I do want to put a plug in for the wonderful book that has been published, The Experimental Self, to which you both contributed. A beautiful book published by the Munch Museum in conjunction with this exhibition. And to a certain extent, this discussion is celebrating this book also, as well as the exhibition. At any rate, I thought it might be interesting to begin with the question, a sort of broad question. Basically, why are Munch's photographs, especially the selfies, of interest now? What do they tell us about Munch or art in general? Pat, how about you?
I'll start. Ed, it's great to see you, and MaryClaire, great to see you too. And I'm happy that we're having this conversation. So I think one thing that I will say is that I think Munch somehow is never out of fashion as an artist. He's always somehow in the present tense, and his work is always in the present tense, particularly the scream that seems to be, it keeps growing and changing with every political moment. And so, in a funny way, Munch is sort of everywhere, or at least that image is. And knowing that, I think, thinking about the artist who has produced one of the greatest icons of the 20th and now into the 21st century, it's fascinating to kind of get an inside view of his world. And I think the photographs, on one level, speak to his overall practices, because he was so experimental in his printmaking, in his painting, in his poetry and writing, and then also when he picked up a camera. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that technically later. But we seem to get a really intimate view of an artist practicing a kind of a new technique on himself and using himself as a subject, which he did in all of his media. But there's something so immediate about the photographs. As tiny as they are, I think they are like little keyholes into his world at various moments. And MaryClaire, I know you've written about the selfies. You're really interested in selfies as a phenomenon.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's this Munch that we have in our head. He's the only artist that I know of that has his own emoji, which in some ways I feel is very connected to selfie culture and sort of the idea of kind of internet culture. But I think what makes the selfies so interesting is that even from when we started working on this book a year ago, the technology for filters and other editing editing technology has just gone even crazier than it was a couple of years ago. And I while I was writing this article, I was wondering, not would Munch use filters, but how would he use them? Because he certainly wouldn't use them in the correct way, and he wouldn't use them in the way that we would expect him to use them. Similar to how kind of Cindy Sherman has not used the Instagram trope at all in the way that we would consider quote unquote correct. And so I think it kind of points towards that the fact that the medium itself can be such an experimental space, we just have to remember to really go back towards that criticality, which we tend not to do while taking our own selfies. But at the same time, since COVID has really become our daily experience now, more and more people have kind of been using the selfie or internet culture, especially Instagram, in kind of this tongue-in-cheek manner of making fun of their daily mundane lives. And the selfie has become almost a sarcastic thing, even to show how boring life is. And that also makes me think of Munch, because he certainly would have thought about it in a very similar way, I think.
Can I pick up on something? Two things you just said. When you said he wouldn't use, he didn't use, I love the, parentheses you got about he wouldn't use various filters in a correct way. That's one thing. And then the other is self-advertising. Because one of the, some of the interesting things are, I think, as you were kind of alluding, that Munch never used materials and media in an orthodox manner, always sort of pushing the edges or thinking sideways about how a new effect might become a language in his, for example, in his woodcuts, or the way he used oil paint. So I love the idea of not using filters correctly. And I think, had he been alive right now, probably that'd be the case. The other thing, though, is that the photographs really were private. He didn't share his selfies, and he didn't share most of his photographs. He did send some photographs to his very close correspondents, largely to representations of his artwork rather than himself. So, it's hard to picture how these selfies would become part of a chain of communication the way a true selfie is now. I kind of see him with these selfies just really playing with himself and his own self-image. And one more thing I was going to say, sorry, is the idea about the filter. I think he was using those cameras themselves as some kind of filtering system, because of the way that he continually used them as a timing instrument, that he was blurred or he was smeared, or in some way or another, just using these little relatively inexpensive orthodox handheld cameras. He found ways of reinventing himself in front of the lens, which is kind of what filters enable us to do.
And I wonder, because he does these so purposefully and sometimes so correctly, these kind of weird ways of double exposures and stuff that other photographers were doing specifically and on purpose. So I also wonder if he was also not only aware of his own experimentation, but what other people were doing in the media and really engaging with it as a body of work.
Was he making multiple versions of every picture? In other words, we see one selfie. How many prints did he make to lead up to that one selfie?
I don't think we know.
You don't know.
We only know what we have in the archive. There aren't that many prints in the archive. And so I think all we can work with is what we have seen. But there are some, for example, some of the photographs he took of his works of art that he was documenting in his studio, there are multiple prints on different, using different time exposures, using different paper to see what the effects were. But more than that, we have this archive, and so we can only project into it.
And do you find, or do you believe he was exhibiting a lot of humor in his selfies? You talk about our current selfies always are very humorous, or quite often humorous, but were his?
Oh, I'm absolutely convinced there's so much humor in it. And partially, I think it is because, like Pat mentioned, that they weren't meant to be shared so much as kind of his own play with himself. And when I was working on the drawing project, it was kind of Something I didn't expect when I went into the project was how humorous Munch's drawings were, where he's making jokes, he's making caricatures, he is making fun of himself, he's making fun of everybody in the Christiania art scene. And I feel like this kind of repetition of play with himself is very much this kind of self-critical, tongue-in-cheek, like, ooh, look at me, I'm the artist, I'm the subject. And I think the Death of Marat selfie is the one that I just can't help but laugh, or even his nude selfies. I think he's just, it's very serious, but it's also very funny at the same time. And I think that's something he's such a master of.
Yeah, I wanna echo that with the nude selfies, because he strikes these hyper heroic poses, which, you know, are, it's kind of in its own way, it's really charming. The one on the beach where he's got this loincloth like covering to his lower bits. Um, you know, as though he's a warrior with his canvas behind him. So it's, you know, it's kind of, it seems like it's that ironic, you know, so many layers of ironic self-staging, or perhaps, you know, real staging. Again, we're projecting. But with the selfies, too, the later ones where they're so perfectly cropped, one after another, obviously using a mirror to orient himself, because he didn't have an iPhone. He had a little, you know, this apparatus, and all he could do is look into the lens and not really know what was going to come out at the other end. In those, back in the day when people practiced analog photography, you'd take pictures, he sent them out to be processed, and then maybe something great comes out of it. But so obviously using a mirror, he could locate himself and know where he was going to be in that frame. So right away, I love the notion of him continually, you know, with his jacket and his collar, and for me, you know, the hat, and then without the hat, and, you know, staging. And maybe some of that we could see as, you know, we could, as a kind of an emotional process, to see himself as he's aging, and particularly because he had this terrible eye episode where he was just near blinded, that there's something very moving about seeing himself in these selfies. But they're all, some of them are super charming too. And one more thing to say about the nude self-portraits, there's one that he took in, you know, of himself, or someone took of him in Oscarstrand, that there's that great phrase that he used in a letter to a friend, saying once he saw a picture of himself, he decided it was time to get more exercise, right? Like looking at his belly.
Was he vain?
Maybe in the same level of vanity that we all are.
Okay, I mean, he wasn't noted for his vanity. He wasn't a particularly showy dresser or anything like that.
Uh-huh. No, he was noted for his extreme beauty. I mean, his biographers, so many of his biographers talk about his physical beauty and about this chin, the noble chin. And he was a very natty dresser. And I think that's one of the things that we can begin to see in some of the photographs, but even reports from his friends about being concerned about what he should wear when he showed up for various events would suggest that he was so aware of image. He was so aware of image. And MaryClaire, I know in the project you did at the Munch Museum with the drawings, we see a lot of these, some of them caricatures, where he's pushing his chin sort of way forward, and that becomes a kind of a trope within his, you know, humorous self-portraiture.
And it's funny because even the caricatures of him today by, say, Stefan Kverneland pick up on that chin and kind of project it even forward into the future.
That's great. That's great. Tell me, how do you see Munch's photography intersecting with his overall practice? Did he think of it equal to his prints or woodcuts, or was it just a sort of sideline amusement?
I don't think, in as much as we can know, that he saw this in as the equivalent of his paintings or his woodcuts or drawings, because it really was a private practice. These are things he made for himself, of himself. But he used photographs a lot in the production of his work. And Arne Eggum wrote a groundbreaking book in 1988 that really traced Munch's relationship with photograph as a partner photography as a partner in the production of some of his other works. But the way I see it, this was just a little experimental sideline that was really fun. That he was really interested in technology. He was an early adapter of various kinds of technology, telephones, automobiles. And so here was this mechanical device that suddenly was, blanketing the world. And so that was something that it seems to me more like a trifle or an amusement. I don't know, MaryClaire, do you have?
I feel like, yeah, I think I agree. And also, but I think at the same time, even though he views the camera as not really up to the same as quote unquote art making, I think he also views it as kind of an extent. He can't do the same thing that painting can do, but it kind of extend his artistic practice and kind of, in a lot of these play with the selfies especially, I feel like he's trying to push the boundaries of how do you represent the self subjectively in a quote unquote objective medium. And of course, photography scholars today would say the photograph is anything but objective, but Munch and sort of the discourse around photography in the early 20th century very much viewed it as the epitome of objectivity. And so I feel like his purposeful disruptions of it are in very much a continuation of his symbolist idea of how to bring forward subjectivity and what are the means to do so in yet another medium. Even if it's not quite on the level of his paintings and printmaking, in his own opinion.
Mm-hmm. No, agreed. And he also said, of course, that this aphorism that he even liked so much he published coming out of his diaries, that the camera can never compete, with a paintbrush, until you can start taking photographs in heaven or hell, kind of a thing. But the other thing that they do intersect with, whether this was intentional or just generational, was of course pictorialist photography. The whole purpose of pictorialism, thinking about Alfred Stieglitz or Fred Holland Day here in the US, or Gertrude Käsebier or any of the Europeans, was precisely to do what you just said, which is to use this so-called objective scientific medium to manifest sensibility, right? So his works do intersect with that as well. And then the later works, the 1920s works look so much like, for example, experimental Bauhaus close-up, so-called objective photography. So he was a consumer of images, and it's hard to know what he actually saw and played with, but it's certainly an unusual practice. His.
Did he ever use photography as a way of exploring composition for his larger works? For instance, making a number of photographs of a subject that he then manipulated a bit when he actually painted the subject.
There's the nude from Varnamunda, right?
Yeah, there are, I think more about the portraiture, because he did, and he was very lucky to engage in a lot of very important portrait commissions. Mm-hmm. And so I guess one of the most famous ones, or one of the ones that's received a lot of writing, is a portrait that he did on a commission of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, when he was spending time in Germany. And so Nietzsche was dead, so he didn't have a live subject, but he had photographs to work with. And that's one in which he did have like so-called objective physical evidence of a person who had been, that he did manipulate. And that's what he often enabled him to do with portraiture if he didn't have a live subject in front of him, or did for a period of time and then the person left, and that's what he had to work with.
What do we learn from Munch's photos about the status of photography in the larger sense in the time in which he lived, the early 20th century?
So, I think any number of things. The first is to remember how inexpensive handheld cameras were. When he first bought his handheld camera, he started taking pictures in 1902. Kodak had already been blanketing the world and commodifying and mass marketing handheld cameras, like crazy, advertising them. And so the fact that he had a camera and he was practicing amateur photography is not unlike other middle class or elite people who could afford a camera. So number one, I think it tells us something about the way in which photography entered daily life and daily discourse for so many people. The fact that he had a home developing kit, it seems he had a home developing kit. So he had this, a little, light blocking device where he could develop his own film and then he could print his own prints. Also says something about the way in which Kodak as a company was marketing all kinds of materials up to and including little prepackaged chemistry sets. So it tells us a lot about amateur practice and the fact that when you look at the history of amateur photography, which has become so popular in museums over the last decade, the collections of amateur works, or anonymous pictures from photo albums, it's charmingly, ghosts and smears and like a random hand coming in from the side, just charmingly everywhere in amateur photography. Mistakes abounded everywhere. And so I think some of his photographs from early on tell us a little bit about all of those mistakes that I think he seemed to have begun to capitalize on as a kind of a form language in his photography.
Yeah, I think drawing precisely off of that, one thing that I think is really fascinating that Tom Gunning's article in the book really pushes to the fore is kind of this balance between, we don't know if it's experimentation or mistake. We don't know if it's kind of pushing the boundaries between if it's vernacular or art practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's all these in-betweens. And we have Munch's photography partially because, he's Munch and we had his estate. And so we're very lucky we got some photographs in there. But these things could have been lost to time, like so many other family photographs. But I wonder, as we're getting more and more of these collections that show the exact same thing, was Munch manipulating this medium because he was an artist and that's the way he was thinking? Certainly. But I guess how many other people were also kind of really playing with their Kodak cameras also? We presuppose that people used it via the manual, but how many other people were like, okay, let's try this. Let's see if this works. Or just liking the weirdness that occurs if you don't use it, quote unquote, properly. And so I think the blurring between this vernacular and art praxis or experiment versus on purpose really brings to the fore that Munch was not alone in this. It really was kind of a moment, just like we don't all take proper selfies today or proper photographs with our camera. And I think that's what's really interesting, that this potential for the medium to kind of teach you about your own way of experiencing the world continuously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Swedish artist Strindberg was also a photographer, wasn't he? And do you see any similarities between the type of work he did? Did he do a lot of selfies? Was he similar to Munch in that, or?
Not in this way. He did. There were quite a few self-portraits that were very highly staged that exist from within his practice, collaborative within his practice. And the photographs that I think are closest to what Munch, in terms of kind of experimentation and thinking about the capacity of photographs to record or not record the material world, were his celestigraphs, where Strindberg laid pieces of photosensitive paper out to just let time and light and dirt and whatever was accruing create the image, so that his cameraless photography, is something that is really radical, actually, at that time in his practice. Mm-hmm. They're very different kinds of practices, but the artists really, the two of them really intersected in their fascination with what could happen beyond the sensorium. I think that's one of the questions that MaryClaire, you were sort of alluding to. Are these just mistakes? Like somebody who couldn't bother to read the manual? Or is there something about his use of photography that was really intent upon examining what happens beyond what we can see? Because that's one of the other things photography did in Munch's lifetime, through microscopes, through telescopes, offer perspectives on the universe that the eye couldn't capture. So what else is out there? Are there auras? This is one of the things Munch was interested in, Strindberg was interested in. so that our sensorium, what the five senses are limiting, because there's so much else that potentially is happening beyond our capacity. So that's something both artists were fascinated with and worked with in their practices.
And of course, Munch worked with film also, the moving picture, which we have in the exhibition. How does that differ or is similar to his work with photography?
Well, I think, and again, probably MaryClaire, you can pull me back on this one and remind me that somebody with a camera just wishing all over the place is just like a really potentially very bad filmmaker. But Munch was really interested in time, again, in the things that photography can do and that film can do are literally register time as some kind of visual phenomenon, and in a different way than a painting or a drawing or even something super spontaneous doesn't really hold within it the potential to be seeing an object over time in motion. And that's something Munch was interested in, seemingly in some of his paintings, and absolutely in his photography. There's one photograph that we have of him in Warnemünde, where he's seated on a couch, and he obviously has sat there for a period of time so that the image is registered on the photographic emulsion, and then he ducks down so that everything behind him shows right through his body like a ghost, a practiced kind of mistake. And it's that kind of image that for me signals his interest in time and working with time, and that the camera is an object that can be playful in time. And then the films are kind of fascinating because he just didn't seem like he was at all interested in having a fixed camera. Everything is in motion all over the place. And so that the little film clips that you have in the gallery are kind of this wonderful way of thinking about the artist, thinking about motion and time and dynamism, because the camera is always dynamic in his hands.
I think to add to that dynamism, we also have to remember that you're kind of seeing a man in rapture of a changing Oslo at the same time. This face of Oslo is changing at a technological speed that was just unprecedented. And so you kind of see the childlike glee as he's running around trying to film this changing city. I think you have to remember, the first trams, really roads that were not just mud and stuff are really coming into the city at the time. The town hall is about to be kind of really begin groundbreaking. So a lot of these things are really at the heart of why he's so kind of almost enraptured with the frenetic city. And I feel like his videography kind of matches the city at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And he does use himself. He photographs himself or films himself. So he does his selfies on film. What do you think of those?
That's where I see so much humor. As he duck walks, like Charlie Chaplin duck walks into the camera and looks at it and then walks backwards out of there. So yeah, humor. And I love the idea of just rapture, not just with the city, but this toy. It's like obviously his film camera was so much of a toy in that particular summer that he was using it. And then he does stuff that you'd think a 5-year-old would do. He sneaks up on his sister, who then goes like, "Get out of here! You're bothering me," kind of a thing. So I think, to get back to your first question, Ed, I think one of the things we get to see is this private person being playful. And that's a really privileged view, I think.
Yeah, especially with the man we associate with the screen, because we take him so seriously.
Tell me, he photographed over a span of about 40 years, but inconsistently. Is that correct? He would photograph for a couple of years and then not photograph, or was he always photographing?
I think what we have is our archive. Is the Munch Museum's archive, which is very short, actually, from 1902 to around 1910, and then again around 1927 into the very early 1930s. And it may be that that is the sum total of his work with cameras, but it also may be that there's just things that haven't been retained.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But certainly in that first little under a decade when he was using a camera, it really was a crucial part of his life. And, just really becoming this, very, very prolific exhibitor, artist, exhibiting around breakthrough exhibitions in Germany and then elsewhere in Europe, and traveling all the time. He was really frenetic in his movements and in launching exhibitions, in holding exhibitions. His fame was growing. He had just had this, love affair ending with a bullet shot to his finger, whatever the circumstances were, in pain all the time from a damaged hand. And so it was a really kind of precarious moment of his life and his world. And so that's where we also get to see him in hotel rooms and in his summer house and outdoors trying to benefit from the sun and so on. So that was just part of this very dense life of his. And then the later years when he's living in Ekkeli, just outside of the edge of Oslo, there's a lot more space to practice, I suppose. Although even and still in the summer of 1927, when he is working with a film camera, we started to take pictures again. Major retrospectives, life retrospectives of his work in Berlin and in Oslo. Again, at this period of great reopening in a way in terms of his career.
With all of that happening, did he ever use photography as a very literal method of recording something? For instance, you talk about his great exhibitions at that time. Did he photograph those exhibitions? Did he keep any record, just use it as a record for what had happened? Or was it always much more personal?
So we don't have any photographs that he took, installation shots, for example, from the 20s. We do have a few from from early on, 1902. We've got a couple of those photographs that he seems to have taken. But it was really documenting the works in his studio, his home and studio. There are a lot of photographs of individual paintings and of corners of the studio. And that's where he was performing in some of those selfies in front of his works that he was otherwise, recording.
Fascinating. So out of the whole process of putting this exhibition together and writing this book, have you learned a lot of new things about Munch? Pat, you have spent a great deal of your career studying Munch. Do new revelations come forward all the time?
Kind of do, I think. I first saw the photographs when I was a grad student, when I was doing my first research at the Munch Museum, kind of the place where MaryClaire is finishing her PhD actually right now, completing it. And I thought they were fascinating back then, and I think that was a moment when Arne Eggen was also writing his book about the photographs, and really learning a lot about them really helped me to think about the artist who was a multi-artist. I mean, really, a lot of people understand him to be a painter because they look at the screen or they think he's a printmaker. Maybe they're aware of his writing, but I think the fascination with all media and how they might intersect or overlap or be, one set of experimental practices may enter another arena, that for me is actually really exciting to think about. And I guess for me, the late self-portraits, where he's playing with time in various kinds of ways, playing roles of his, I see him playing off of his past self in different ways. I feel like gives me an insight into this person both living in his head and living in the world simultaneously, if that makes sense.
MaryClaire, in terms of the work that you've been doing, has this been a revelation to you in certain ways about either Munch or about selfies as a whole? Or
Well, I'm much earlier in my career, so I feel like every time I look at Munch, there's something that I have no idea about that I'm ready to kind of think about. I think with Munch, I think when I got to do this article and think really critically about his self-portraits, what really kind of opened it up is to a new way of play with seriality, because I think before I'd thought of Munch as this very serious man in picturing himself, even though the drawings, he's very funny and humorous with himself. And a lot of his most canonized images, it's very much this kind of serious artist that we're expected to see. And I feel like seeing that humor really both humanizes Munch as a subject, but also kind of makes you think about your own facetious, in a way, relationship with your own selfies, because they're not always very serious. But I think it also made me think a lot about the artworks that I'm studying now, and the artists I'm studying are really looking at Munch during this time as this kind of hero. And so to see him kind of playing this heroic figure is also very funny. And thinking about how he's kind of creating his own legacy, not only looking towards the past, but this is when he knows he wants to create a museum in his honor. And so he's also thinking, he potentially knows we're going to see these photographs in the future. He's projecting himself to some imagined future that he is imagining this new museum to be. And I think that kind of thinking of how hyper aware he is of his own image, not just in that moment of that selfie, but his entire past, present, and future self. Kind of, it's a very, very conscious practice that I potentially do in my own selfie practice, but I don't think nearly to any of that extent. And I think that that's what's so fascinating, is how realizing how hyper aware he is of his own identity at all times.
And I'll follow up on that by saying that that's something he was aware of from very early in his career, was his self-presentation and his public persona, because there's often a gap between the public persona, the persona that we think we know through the art, and what was happening behind the screen of his work. So having shaped his persona and worked with his closest promoters over his entire lifetime, I agree with you that these selfies kind of contain within them. I like the way you just said that. A moment, this exact moment now, but also looking backwards and then looking toward the future. Not clear that he ever knew anybody else would really see these photographs, but he did state in his writing that he had been collecting them, and that maybe someday when he wrote his autobiography, they'd see the light of day, which I guess gives us permission to think about them in a public way and exhibit them. But a more self-aware artist and a more controlled artist is hard to imagine.
And in that, he's almost very much of the 21st century, isn't he? The focus on self-presentation, self-awareness, and the manipulation of one's own self-image. Very interesting.
Oh, and he also commissioned photographers to take pictures of him doing his work as well. And those were promotional. So some of the photographs of him, he hired professional photographers to take pictures of him that then would be released into local newspapers, for example.
Fascinating, fascinating. Any further thoughts? MaryClaire, anything further you'd like to think about?
I guess one thing we didn't touch on that I also think about when I think about especially his bathing and nude selfies is there's a reason why photography and video performance were so taken up by the feminist art movements, is because of their potential to really play with ideas of gender and sexuality and the self in kind of these very nuanced ways that the photograph didn't allow them to do in painting, or that the video didn't allow them to happen in painting. And I guess one thing is for future research in Munch's photographic practices is there's sort of some images where he really is starting to play with kind of masculine gender identity, in that he's grabbing an apple, kind of like an Eve, or in the Garden of Eden. And I think that, he's not just these are questions that also Munch was asking throughout his practice on ideas of gender and sexuality. And I think even that enters into his photographic practice, but is beyond the scope of today.
topic for another panel, perhaps.
I hope so.
Any thoughts on that, Pat?
Oh, yeah. I mean, both MaryClaire and I have been writing about this for years. And he did intervene. So much of his work really played around the edges of gender norms in quite remarkable ways. And I think some of his images too, really, I mean, yes, the party line is that he was a misogynist and he was endlessly attacking women and, you know, hyper masculine in that way of being. I think he was remarkable in the way that he played with masculinity and offered a kind of vulnerability very often in his work, and transgressed gender norms in remarkable kinds of ways, so that this is an area that needs much more elaboration and analysis.
And there's even some of what you mentioned, the practices that he does in printmaking where the female body almost becomes dematerialized, is also happening in the photographs when we see these kind of ghost figures. So I that's one area that I'm just like, oh, so somebody needs to do something with that.
Well, with that, I'd like to draw a reluctant close to our discussion, and it's been illuminating. And great thanks to you, MaryClaire, and Pat, to you for this, and also for the organization of a wonderful exhibition. You've done so many great things here at ASF. You're both fellows of ASF, with which we take great pride. And particular thanks should also be offered to the Munch Museum, which was a wonderful collaborator on this exhibition, has been the producer, the publisher of this terrific book. And we are looking forward to seeing their new building. So great thanks to you all, and also to William and Ingrid Ginsberg for the support of this and the exhibition. With that, I'll say goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you soon, hopefully in real life. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.